Michelle.
And I'm Lucy.
Welcome to another sort of cameo episode.
It's a pre-Edward Woodville, I nearly said Edward Woodward again, Edward Woodville episode.
Yeah, so not quite a cameo, a prequel, shall we call it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll go with that.
Go.
Yeah.
And it is on the Woodville family.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the most evil family in history, apparently.
I don't think so.
No, that's not what I got.
Okay, after we're done this, we'll compare them with the Borgias.
Okay. Or the family that poor Caterina Cornaro married into in Cyprus, where one of them bit off someone else's nose.
Yeah, what the heck?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. They don't do that. I started to write the episode about Edward Woodville, but his life was so enmeshed in that of his family, at least initially, that I realised I'd have to do an episode on the Woodvilles just
To make
sense. Yeah, sort of makes sense. So, yeah, this week the Woodvilles and next week Edward. But first, we have Patreons to thank.
Ooh, awesome.
Holly Morgan, Andrew Zudi, Gail Browning, and Gillian Ole, or Ole, I'm not sure, O-L-E. Sorry, okay. Gillian. I'm assuming it's Ole.
And I am really fighting the urge to say, Ole!
Yes. But also, if Gail Browning would like to email us with her address at Tudoriferous@gmail.com, we will send her a mug, since she is our 100th patron.
Yay! Wow, actually, I think we're reasonable to listen to.
Sorry, Gillian, you were 101 and that doesn't count. So, yes, congratulations, Gail.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
Congratulations. And congratulations us.
Yeah, 100 people have chosen to
listen to us.
Waste their time.
Who wander off on tangents, although we do edit out most of our tangents.
Yes.
You get a 1 hour episode. What we've actually recorded is 3 hours.
Most of it ranting.
Pretty much. Why?
Yes. Why don't they tell us these things? Why do they tell us the things we don't need to know instead of the ones we do need to know, which is usually the minutiae that we want to know?
Yeah.
Okay, I've put headings in again to break it up.
Nice.
Jaquetta and Richard.
Oh, Jaquetta.
Jaquetta, are you better? Are you well? What was that, Loretta? I can't remember. It's
I don't know.
Long ago. I think it must have been Loretta. It wasn't Jaquetta.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Jaquetta, although I'd love to bring Jaquetta back. That's a really cool name.
It is. Yes, it's a nice one. Mm-hmm. I mean, for all we know, Luxembourg is riddled with Jaquettas, but not many in this country. So first mystery, how did the very well-born, well-connected Jaquetta of Luxembourg meet her considerably more lowly future husband, Richard Woodville?
Are we going to start with how she ended up in England?
Yep. Yeah, I'm going back to... Yes, she was married to John, Duke of Bedford, who was the younger brother of the late Henry V, and was regent of France for the little Henry VI. Very little Henry VI. So it was a good match, and a more evenly balanced one socially than her next marriage, except that he was 44 and she was 17.
Yeah.
Which I don't like. I know she's old enough and everything, but I don't like it.
No.
This match upset Philip the Bold of Burgundy, since Bedford had been married to Philip's sister Anne. And she had died, and Bedford had got hitched again with what Philip saw as unseemly haste.
45 minutes.
It didn't show enough respect to his sister.
And to him, in turn.
And to him, yeah. More to the point, really, I think.
Yes.
Also, the bride's father, Pierre of Luxembourg, Monsieur Saint-Paul, who we came across in Louis XI's episode, was a vassal of Philip's and by rights should have asked his permission. So this caused a rift between Burgundy and the Regency in France, because as we see so often, the political comes from the personal.
Yeah.
You married my sister too quickly, therefore this is war. Yes.
Oh, dear.
So the happy, if mismatched in age, couple sails for England in 1433.
Were they happy? Do we know if they were
We don't
happy?
know. We don't know about that one.
Okay, I'm going to hope they're happy.
We don't hear otherwise.
You don't...
Well, if we ever do, well, we're not going to do an episode on Bedford, but, you might find from his angle, perhaps he hated her or perhaps he was besotted by her. We won't know unless we... Well, perhaps I'll look up Bedford before we do Edward next week and see if anything's mentioned on his side. Well, I did look it up, and it turns out he was happily married to his previous wife, Anne of Burgundy, but whether his marriage to Jacquetta was happy or not, it's not said. So he was capable of being happy in a marriage, so let's hope it was. England was being looked after by Bedford's brother, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. And Humphrey and Bedford didn't get on. I don't know why I've gone with Humphrey and Bedford. It's a bit like when we always go for Edward, Richard and Clarence, don't we? Even though his name's not Clarence.
No.
So, they didn't get on. And the reason Bedford was returning to England was to answer charges of negligence for his rule in France.
Oh, dear.
Probably brought by his brother.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Nobody seems to do very well in France, do they?
Nope. I wonder if they're all like, can we have a volunteer for handling France? And everybody steps back one, except for one person.
Yes, who was staring at a spider in the corner of the room. Thinking,
Yep.
What? Hang on. I wonder if it's just an impossible job. That's why it's all...
Well, it would be.
disaster.
They don't actually have France.
No.
It's nothing but war, and you're going to lose territory and gain territory no matter what you do.
And every time you lose it, you failed. It's a bit like
Yes.
being a football manager, I think. If you lose a game, that's it, you're a failure.
Yeah.
Later that year, Jacquetta became a denizen of England, and she was made a Lady of the Garter. So it's nice.
Right.
I don't know what you have to do to become Lady of the Garter. I think you just have to be, really, don't you, to be the right person.
Probably, but wasn't she very good friends with Margaret of Anjou?
Well, that's it. I think you need to be the right person.
Yes. Somebody has to like you.
Yes. For the man, it's a chivalric thing. You have to prove yourself, don't you? Which
Yes.
is why Fastolf lost his, because he was accused of cowardice. Whereas I think for a woman... the accusation of cowardice is hardly going to be an issue, is it?
No, it would probably be you were unfaithful to your husband or something. Get you kicked out. Or treason.
Treason, yeah. Yeah.
Especially during the War of the Roses, you decided to support the Yorkists.
Yes, just suddenly finding yourself marooned on the wrong side when everything's changed, yeah. The following year, presumably having answered the case of negligence, they sailed back to France, where Bedford fell ill and died. Jacquetta was left well off, but not as rich as she might have been, since Humphrey of Gloucester contested the English properties left to her. And in fact, she spent much of her time battling to retain her land.
Goodness, you're never safe. You cannot pick a station or a time. You're never going to be safe. That's horrible. I was thinking when we went back to who would you want to live their life? And it comes back to nobody. Somebody in a convent.
I was about to say Jacquetta's life was quite nice, but as we'll see, there's a lot of sorrow in her life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, she obviously didn't spend all the time contesting her lands, though, because she still found time for love. Ooh. On the 23rd of March, 1437, she remarried without the permission of the king.
Her bit of rough.
Her bit of rough. The reason she didn't seek his permission was presumably because she thought he'd say no.
Which he would have.
Yes.
Better to ask for forgiveness than to ask for permission? Or beg for forgiveness to ask for permission? Yeah.
Well, yes, the forgiveness cost them £1,000, but it was done by then, so,
Ha-ha.
Yes. Her bit of rough was Richard Woodville. And his dad had been the Duke of Bedford's Chamberlain, and he was Lieutenant of Calais. But he was just a mere squire. But his son, Woodville, was knighted the same day that Bedford had knighted the 4-year-old King Henry VI. Richard would have met Jacquetta when he was in the Duke of Bedford's retinue. But there's a big leap from being in a man's retinue to marrying his widow.
Yes, there is. Were you doing something on the sly?
We don't know, because unfortunately that's the bit of the story that's missing. Inevitably, since it would have been clandestine, wouldn't it? So I suppose there might be love letters around, but we don't know. By the time the marriage was out in the open, it was said there was nothing Jacquetta's furious family could do about it. She might already have been pregnant by that point, in which case there would be nothing they could do about it.
And they did have a lot of children.
They did. Richard's family was a lot less furious, surprisingly. When he came to introduce his wife, they probably leapt for joy and thought, wow.
Or bowed to her because she did have a higher rank than he did.
Oh, far, yeah.
Yeah, because she'd still carry the title of Dowager Duchess. They don't get rid of that when they remarry. Well, doesn't it raise the social standing of the entire family when somebody marries above their station? Doesn't it?
It certainly didn't do any harm for the Woodvilles when Elizabeth married Edward.
Well, yeah.
Richard was, quote, beautiful and well-formed in his person, unquote. And he was an excellent jouster. So a bit of a sportsman.
Playboy.
Quite fit, yeah. As you say, the couple do seem to be exceptionally fertile. Or they just bred healthy children and nearly all of them survived. But, yeah, they had quite a few.
She used witchcraft to keep her children safe.
Oh, yes. The children were Anthony, Elizabeth, Richard, Anne, Mary, Jacquetta, John, Eleanor, Lionel, Edward and Catherine. Wow. That's a lot.
Yes.
There must have been an awful lot of, come here, Mary. No, Anne. No, John. No, Jacquetta.
Yes. No. Fifth child.
We don't know the order they came in. Some say Elizabeth came first, based on a portrait of Elizabeth said to have been painted in 1463, in which she was said to be 26. But we're not sure of the accuracy of that date, because Elizabeth's first husband had just been killed. She was a widow with 2 children. She was fighting her in-laws for her property. Was that really the time she'd suddenly decided to commission a portrait? So we're not sure. That's what's written on it, but
this is what I always wonder. So we've got that she commissioned a portrait then, but that probably wasn't the only one. So if there were others that just don't exist anymore, we don't have notation of them, are we putting too much focus on the time that she commissioned this one? You know what I mean? Because we don't know of others.
Maybe if she wasn't constantly trying to get her possessions back, she was living with her parents. Maybe they said, well, we'll cheer you up. We'll get a portrait commissioned or something. It's all just to do with whether Anthony or Elizabeth came first, which doesn't really matter, really. It's because, Anthony's always going to be first because he's the boy. Edward Woodville, the one we're doing next week, was the youngest son, and we think Catherine was the youngest child. In 1440, the family moved to Grafton in Northamptonshire, which they bought from William de la Pole. What with it being a small world and that. In 1445, Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou.
Unfortunately, for both of them.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I think she was good for him, really, wasn't she?
But
she did it all.
It wasn't good for her.
But whether he actually wanted it done, don't know. Yeah, that's a relationship that it will be very interesting to know how that panned out, really. Whether she was a sort of mother figure to him, but she was much younger. When she was very young when she arrived. Anyway, we're not doing them. Prior to that, given that Henry's mother, Catherine de Valois, had married her own bit of rough, Owen Tudor, and had retired from court, the court had been a male preserve. So with the arrival of Margaret, there was a role for Jacquetta, especially given that they were both French.
Yeah, right. If there is no wife, then there's no point in having women there.
No. And being French, they could both talk to each other.
Yes.
Richard Woodville became Lord Rivers in 1448, although no one knows where this title came from, just sort of materialised.
And Lord Rivers, what is that title?
Well, that's it. We don't know.
So it's not Duke or Viscount or Baronet? We have no idea?
I think he's a baron.
Okay.
I think. but we're not quite sure where the rivers came from.
Just made up a word. Pick a
Yeah.
word. What are you looking at? Oh, I'm driving past a river.
Well, he was made Knight of the Garter, sponsored by, amongst other people, Sir John Fastolf.
Oh, okay.
And this was a grim time for the English nobility. They were losing territory in France, and the Jack Cade rebellion rose up in Kent. Richard Woodville was one of the men sent to Kent to quell the uprising, and then later he was indicted for acts committed while he was quelling the uprising.
Oh, gosh. You have to be pretty bad if you get indicted for that.
I think he was quite heavy-handed by the sound of it.
Oh, uncomfortable.
Yeah. Then the Wars of the Roses kicked off, and we've covered that many times. Richard Woodville was almost certainly there for the Love Day, and his son Anthony jousted at the celebrations following it. Richard was probably past it by that time. Were they really celebrating the idea that the Love Day sorted everything out?
They were celebrating, but I don't think anybody honestly thought that was going to work.
No. I mean, yeah, Henry's king, so even if you don't think it's going to work, you're going to say, oh, yeah, good thinking, my lord.
Good job, yeah. Very impressed with what you've gotten done.
Yes.
Yes.
He's an idiot. It's never going to work. We next hear of Richard investigating Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, for his piratical attacks on the ships of the Hanseatic League. And this must have been a bit like Bray telling Edmund de la Pole that he'd been indicted for murdering a commoner. What Warwick thought about being investigated by a mere baron, we can only guess. But we can take a fairly educated guess, given Warwick's later actions. He was not happy.
No, he was definitely not happy.
He's got a tremendous egomania, hasn't he? I mean, yeah.
That's it, too. It wasn't that it was a bad decision, which actually it was, but it was more, I think, his ego getting in the way of, you just made me look like a fool.
Yeah, and with that, I will not put up.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do anything now, but you wait.
Yep. Yep.
When the tide turned against the Yorkists and Richard of York fled to Ireland, the Earl of Warwick and the Earl of March, the future Edward IV, fled to Calais. Richard Woodville was given the task of helping the Duke of Somerset get them out of Calais. However, before he could set off on the 19th of January, why do these people always try and cross the channel in January? 19th of January, 1460, Richard, Jacquetta and Anthony were abruptly woken up and dragged from their beds. Richard and Anthony were taken to Calais, where they were, quote, rated, unquote. And that's not amphibole, martyrdom,
Okay.
flaunt. That's berated.
Ah, okay. I wasn't familiar with that term.
By Warwick and March. Warwick said, quote, that his father was but a squire and he'd made himself by marriage, unquote.
Which he had.
Well, I think Richard
can't
must have
really
found
argue
that hard
that
to
one.
dispute, really. Yes. But it makes it very plain just how Warwick did feel about him being investigated by a mere baron. And obviously at the time, Edward, Earl of March, didn't realise that he was abusing his future father-in-law.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that must have been awkward. Haven't I met you before? Oh. Whoops.
Sorry.
You know how it was.
Yeah, it wasn't my fault. Really. I've always liked you.
Yes. It was all Warwick. You'll notice he was doing the shouting. I would make the tea.
Yep.
When Richard of York returned from Ireland, he was killed in a battle, decapitated, and his head exhibited in a paper crown. It's good when you've already done the Laws of the Roses. You can sort of concertina it up quite a lot.
Yes.
Margaret of Anjou then made her way back down to London, but on the way her troops had run amok in virtually every town they passed through, and Jacquetta was sent as part of the delegation to beg for mercy for London. Please don't loot us. And in fact, as we know, Margaret didn't enter London at all, because they didn't want her.
When you just said that, please don't loot us, we've talked on many occasions of how they really like to terrify themselves with ghost stories and ghoulishness. Why? The rest of your life is terrifying.
Yes, that's right. Why, when all this is happening, you've got the risk of starvation every winter, you've got disease,
Plague.
You've got war. Why on earth did you invent purgatory on top of it all?
Yes.
And witchcraft.
Highwaymen, witches. Although the witches is them making something up as well, but still.
Edward Earl of March entered London and declared himself king. He then went north and met the Lancastrians at Towton. And Richard and Anthony Woodville were fighting on the Lancastrian side, leading 6,000 or 7,000 Welsh troops. So for a while, it looked as if the Lancastrians were winning, but whether it was the good generalship of Edward IV or whether it was because the Lancastrians had snow blowing in their faces, the Yorkists won.
Mm-hmm.
Edward IV wrote to his mother saying, amongst other things, that Anthony Woodville was dead. But he wasn't. He wasn't. Either that was wishful thinking on Edward's part or just confusion of battle.
Okay.
Yeah, it was Towton. It was the bloodiest battle on English soil, so there's going to be a lot of bodies to sift through and work out who's who, isn't there?
And not all of them are going to be recognisable.
No.
Which is horrific to say.
Yes, if you go to Somerset Museum in Taunton, there are some skulls there with some rather nasty-looking wounds in them. I think they're Civil War ones, but they'd have been the similar type of wounds.
Yes.
My 6-year-old granddaughter's fascinated by them.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, if they weren't in glass, I think she'd be sticking her finger through the holes.
Oh, wow.
Following Towton, Richard and Anthony decided to switch sides and follow Edward, which is curious behaviour for people who've been dragged from their beds by this man and taken across the channel and shouted at.
Yeah.
They received pardons, as did Anthony's younger brother Richard. But why did they swap over? Well, according to the ubiquitous envoy from Milan, do you think it's compulsory? There always has to be an envoy from Milan on every circumstance.
If not, we'll sneak him in.
Well, he asked Richard, quote, he answered me that the cause was lost irretrievably, unquote. So maybe one look at Henry VI was enough to think, oh, honestly, is he worth fighting for? I'm afraid. Yeah, they might have thought, if you look at Edward and then you look at Henry, there's no competition really, is there?
None. Especially if Henry's in his catatonic state at this point.
Yeah. Oh, poor bloke. Anthony was with the Yorkist army when they besieged the Lancastrians at Alnwick Castle. I was looking at Alnwick Castle the other day on a programme about gardening. Amazing water cascade they've got. Mm. Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth's early life is pretty cloudy. We don't know her birth date, with her being a woman. We don't know when Elizabeth married John Grey, but we do know they had 2 children. Thomas, later to be Marquess of Dorset and a general pain in the backside, and Richard. And we know that John Grey was killed at the Battle of St Albans in 1461. And there were the usual legal wranglings since Elizabeth's mother-in-law had just remarried Sir John Bourchier, or Bourchier, or however you pronounce this thing. And she was very reluctant to allow Elizabeth to have her jointure consisting of manors in Northampton and Essex. And Elizabeth was worried about her son's inheritance, so she drew on the help of William Lord Hastings. And they drew up a contract that Thomas or Richard, if Thomas were to die, would marry one of Hastings' daughters or nieces. Assuming that he had any. He didn't have any yet.
Oh, okay.
So Thomas is effectively betrothed to an imaginary girl.
That's insane.
It is. We've come across that before with
yes,
when we were waiting for a Prince James of Scotland. And they didn't have one yet. Eventually they had 2. Also, Hastings wasn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart, because these people never do. If they should get the properties back from Elizabeth's mother-in-law, Hastings and Elizabeth should halve the income.
Okay.
Also, if Thomas and Richard were to die, or if Hastings didn't have any daughters or nieces, Elizabeth would have to pay him 250 marks. I suppose that's for his trouble.
What? So he's winning no matter what?
Yeah, I'm beginning to feel Richard III was quite right to drag him out and behead him now. He doesn't seem a very nice man.
No.
The story we usually hear is that Elizabeth knew that Edward IV was hunting in the area, so she hung about under an oak tree with her 2 boys. And when Edward came up, she dropped to her knees and asked him to help her.
And then he held a knife to her, or she held a knife to him.
Yes. No, the first one is really quite disturbing, I think, given that they get married afterwards.
Yes.
Because either she has the knife and she says, I will kill myself rather than submit to you, or he has the knife and says, I will kill you unless you submit to me.
Yes.
Which is rape.
Yes.
Or they met at the Love Day festivities when she went to see her brother Anthony jousting.
And they just needed some sort of excuse.
In September 1464, Edward IV broke it to his council that he had married not only an Englishwoman, but a relatively low-born one. Mm-hmm. And we know how people like the Earl of Warwick took the news, but even Edward's mother threatened to announce that he'd been born out of wedlock and so wasn't kingly material, despite the fact it reflected more badly on her than on him. I mean, you can't help being a bastard, can you? But you can help being, well, not, you can't always help it, but... Yes. Anyway, what's done is done. The next thing to worry about is what to do with all those Woodville siblings. Well, they were married off, pretty much saturating the market of eligible bachelors and bacheloresses.
There were quite a number of them.
They're quite a number. Anthony Woodville was already married to Elizabeth, daughter of Thomas Lord Scales. And we came across him in Francis Lovell's episode, because if you remember, Lovell's unpleasant and barely lamented father had held the Tower of London and had sprayed a sort of napalm over passers-by.
Right.
He managed to get away, but one of his other conspirators thought he was being taken to safety by boatmen, but when they discovered who he was, they murdered him. And that is Thomas Lord Scales.
Oh, goodness.
Yep, that's Anthony's father-in-law.
Awesome.
Jacquetta, Jr., was married to the wonderfully named Lord Strange of Knockin, and the rest of them were as yet unmarried. And there were still Elizabeth's two sons from the previous marriage to get spliced. The Hastings plan had disappeared when Elizabeth married Edward and had no more use for Hastings. And you can see why these marriages caused so much resentment. People would have called them grossly morganatic. Margaret Woodville married Thomas Lord Maltravers, heir to the Earl of Arundel. Anne Woodville married Henry Bourchier, another Bourchier, heir to the Earl of Essex. Joan married Anthony Grey, eldest son of the Earl of Kent. Mary married Lord Dunster, presumably Dunster in Somerset. Catherine did very well, socially speaking. She married Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham.
Oh.
He was the king's ward and so had very little choice of whom he married, especially given that he was only 9.
I wonder if well, we know when we get to Elizabeth of York's sisters that some of them were quite angry that they had to marry them. I wonder if we ended up with this. Like, that would be almost an immediately abusive relationship.
He was not happy at all.
No.
I mean, he's only 9 at this point, so
yes,
he hasn't really got much of a voice. But he did later say that he scorned his wife because of her humble origins.
Yeah.
Mm. And she'd later marry Jasper Tudor. And then the pool boy. John married Catherine Neville, Duchess of Norfolk. He was 20, she was in her 60s.
Right.
And yet she still outlived him, but through no fault of his own. Thomas Grey, Elizabeth Woodville's son by the previous marriage, married Anne, the only child of the Duke of Exeter. Anne had been promised to a relative of the Earl of Warwick. On top of that, Warwick had had his eye on the Duke of Buckingham for one of his own daughters. And the Duchess of Norfolk, the 60-year-old who married the 20-year-old, was Warwick's aunt. And he saw the marriage to John as a blatant and shameless ploy to exploit the old lady.
Yeah, quite an insult as well.
Well, he saw that as his prerogative to exploit the old lady. How dare you? It's my turn. So add those 3 annoyances on top of his fury at Edward marrying Elizabeth in the first place, and Warwick is not a happy bunny at this point.
No.
So that was the siblings.
Why would you choose a bunny? Not a happy bunny. He's not a happy honey badger. Like, seriously, this is not a nice guy.
No, I know. That's why I quite like the incongruity of him being a little bunny. A sad bunny as well.
All of a sudden, he's the evil bunny in all of the illuminated manuscripts. Have you noticed that?
What, the one that shoots the hunter?
Yeah, they're all over the place in illuminated manuscripts. They've got this thing for bunnies being evil.
Well, perhaps that's how they justify it to themselves, that they've just shot and eaten one. Well, it was probably evil. Anyway, that was the siblings. But now Edward and Elizabeth started filling the court with more Woodvilles in the form of children. First Elizabeth of York in 1466. There's a description of the churching of Elizabeth Woodville after she'd had little Elizabeth.
Ooh.
After the ceremony, Elizabeth went to eat. And Tetzel, a visitor from Nuremberg, wrote, quote, "The Queen sat alone at table on a costly golden chair. The Queen's mother and the King's sister had to stand some distance away. When the Queen spoke with her mother or the King's sister, they knelt down before her until she had drunk water. Not until the first dish was set before the Queen could the Queen's mother and the King's sister be seated. The ladies and maidens and all who served the Queen at table were all of noble birth and had to kneel so long as the Queen was eating. The meal lasted for 3 hours.
Ow!
Everyone was silent and not a word was spoken," unquote.
Okay, that's just the dinner after the ceremony. Do we know what the ceremony was like? I
don't know. I was just taken by that. It sounds miserable for a start, doesn't it, for everyone
Yeah.
involved? And it's not exactly the medieval bacchanalian feast that you get in films with everyone going,
No.
ha ha, and throwing chickens about.
Yeah. There was another... Well, we had talked about it before, where one of them was kneeling under the table.
Yes.
While the woman ate. But 3 hours on your knees. Okay, coming from being a child, and one of my neighbors and one of my best friends at the time, her mother, they didn't spank or anything, but you had to kneel in the corner. Not sit or stand,
that's
but kneel
horrible.
in the corner. And it hurt your knees after a very short time. I can't imagine 3 hours. I hope they were giving cushions.
Yes, they might have got a hassock, mightn't they, to kneel on?
Yeah, something,
yeah.
anything.
But the anti-Woodville faction said it just showed how vain Elizabeth was. And either they were commenting on this because it wasn't normal, or they were just annoyed that a woman who until recently had been hanging around under oak trees waiting to snare kings should have the audacity to do this, to pretend to be a proper queen.
Right. And we'll never pick those apart.
No.
Unless we have a description of that kind of thing somewhere else.
Yeah, there must be. I mean, all women had to be churched, didn't they?
Yes. But that ceremony afterwards?
Yeah.
The dinner?
But I was just trying to think, we come across lots of queens, but they don't have children, do they? That's the problem. Well,
yes.
Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon have one each. Oh, so does Catherine. I'm going to backtrack now. So does Jane Seymour.
Yes. Catherine of Aragon had many children, didn't she?
She had them, yeah. I suppose she still had to be churched even though your child died, didn't you?
Yes.
The next reason they had to criticise Elizabeth was a bit more important than vanity. Murder.
Murder most foul.
And it's one we've come across before when we did Mr. Tiptoft. Mr. Tiptoft executed the Earl of Desmond.
Right.
I remember us mentioning in Tiptoft's episode that Elizabeth Woodville was implicated in this execution, but in fact she was never mentioned at the time. The accusations against her weren't made until the 16th century, and then in a memorandum presented to Henry VIII's Privy Council. And the story goes that Edward IV was out hunting with the Earl of Desmond, and he asked him, "What do people say about me?"
Don't ask that.
Yes, it's not a question you want to hear. His heart must have sank and thought, oh, God, I can't win this, can I? Desmond told him that all good things were spoken of him.
Liar.
But Edward wasn't satisfied and said, no, really, come on, what do people really say about me? And Desmond wasn't an idiot. He kept saying, no, they all love you, sire. You're terrifically popular. Can't we just leave it at that?
Yes, please take the hint, stop asking.
But Edward just kept niggling until at last Desmond said, quote, "If it shall please your grace to pardon me, And not to be offended with that I shall say. So he's going for it.
Don't kill the messenger.
I assure you, I find no fault in any manner of thing, saving only that your grace hath too much abased your princely estate in marrying a lady of so mean a house and parentile, which, still digging this hole.
Oh, shush, shut up.
Though it be perchance agreeable to your lusts, yet, and I think that just means pleasure in general, isn't it? If you love her, I don't think it's lust as in lust. Yet not so, only partly lust in lust. Yet not so much to the security of your realm and subjects, unquote. And there must have been quite a sort of silence you could cut with a knife after that.
As he's sitting there and he just closes his eyes and waits for the executioner's sword. I'm going to die.
And then the king agreed with him. I said, you're right. I married a right munter there, didn't I? Desmond went back to Ireland after that, probably quite quickly.
Yes.
But later on, Edward and Elizabeth were having words. And by the sound of it, it was a full-on shouting match. And Edward said words to the effect that, it's true what my friend Desmond said. You're as common as muck. And
that's not a way to keep your wife happy.
No, she was a bit taken aback by this.
Yeah.
But she got her revenge by contacting Tiptoft and telling him to create the circumstances whereby Desmond should, meet with a little accident.
Yes, just a little one.
Maybe just slip on a rug or fall off his horse. Or just execute him. Come on, Tiptoft, just execute him. Get him out of my hair. There are a few reasons to be sceptical about this story. Firstly, why did this not come to light for several years? Secondly, that memorandum given to Henry VIII's council has never been found. We only know about it by report. Thirdly, although Desmond was in England when he was alleged to have had that conversation with Edward, he was there to counter charges that his tiff with the Bishop of Meath had led to the death of several of the bishop's followers. So it's hardly the circumstances whereby the king and he would go for a little jolly and the king would ask him for marital advice. And, it would all be lovely.
Right.
Fourthly, the memorandum apparently said that Edward IV was so horrified at what had happened to Desmond that he executed Tiptoft. Well, that's not true. Tiptoft was executed in 1470 on the orders of the Earl of Warwick, not of Edward. And that was largely for impaling dead bodies rather than what he did to Desmond. And the story is also mentioned in the Book of Howth, and we came across this source in Lambert Simnel's episode. It's not 100% shiny, reliable. Richard III gave Desmond's son permission to wreak revenge on the killers of his father. And I don't know what he did in Ireland, but one thing he didn't do was come to England and wreak revenge on Elizabeth Woodville. So Desmond Jr. didn't seem to think he had anything to do with it. So I think it's probably a case of cherchez la femme, isn't it? There's a woman involved. It must be her. But it was all good anti-Woodville fodder, although by Henry VIII's reign, would they have needed anti-Woodville fodder? I mean, it's old news by then, isn't it?
Yes.
The Earl of Warwick, the Woodvilles' enemy number one. The relationship between Warwick and Edward was teetering, and this was only partly because of Edward's marriage to Elizabeth. It was more due to foreign policy. Warwick favoured France, Edward favoured Burgundy.
Yes.
And this is where Margaret of Burgundy comes in, because we heard how the French bent over backwards to promise a large dowry and several other concessions so they could have her.
Yeah.
But Edward chose Charles the Bold, who just said, I'll take her off your hands.
Oh, isn't that horrible?
It doesn't cost me anything.
Not only that, he had to pay.
Yes.
Edward had to pay for Charles to take her. How? Oh, poor Margaret.
Well, we're doing Charles. We'll have done Charles. No, we'll be still doing him on Patreon to find out what he thought of the situation. Anthony Woodville was charged with organising a grand jousting tournament, to which he invited the Count of La Roche, otherwise known as the Bastard of Burgundy. I think actually he was the great bastard of Burgundy. Not just a commoner garden bastard of Burgundy. This tournament was the subject of controversy. On the first day, the bastard of Burgundy's horse was killed, and Anthony quickly went to the king and took off all the trappings that covered his horse to prove there was no concealed weapons there. The jousting went on the next day, implying that the bastard of Burgundy didn't think there'd been foul play, although a Burgundian source said that a metal spike was found in the dead horse's nostril.
Ow!
Well, it's grim, but it seems a bit unlikely. There'd be more of a fuss if this was true.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. I think that might have been the Burgundians looking for something to hold over him, maybe at a later date. But the visit wasn't just two over-testosteroned men riding horses at each other. There were also behind-the-scenes negotiations concerning Margaret's marriage to Charles the Bold. And the negotiations were conducted by Anthony Woodville and his father, Earl Rivers. Warwick then came back from France with the French embassy with him to talk wedding bells with France, only to find that it was a done deal.
Gosh, that would be humiliating.
The Woodvilles had got in first.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah.
Warwick wasn't one to hide his feelings. He didn't say, oh no, that's fine, yeah.
Fair play.
Yeah. He refused to go anywhere near the king as long as Earl Rivers and Anthony were with him. Oh, I'm not coming there.
Childish.
Look, they're there. I'm going to wait for them to go. However, he did have the decency to escort Margaret to Margate and to catch the ship to Burgundy.
Did he have the decency, or was it ordered, do this or die?
I don't think Edward's in a position to say you're going to die.
Oh, okay.
Not to
Not
Warwick.
yet.
Not yet. But it was Anthony Woodville who went across the water with her. Not Warwick.
Not Warwick.
Meanwhile, the Earl of Warwick, his daughter Isabel, and her potential husband, poor girl, George Duke of Clarence, were on their way to France themselves. Edward IV had strictly forbidden the marriage, but they were just about to ignore him. Once the deed was done, they issued a statement likening Edward IV to Edward II, Richard II, and Henry VI, all of whom have something in common.
Yeah, they were horrible.
And?
Well, mentally ill.
And?
Well, Richard II was gay.
No. Well, he might have been, but...
Possibly. Well, they both got removed from the throne.
Precisely. All three were deposed.
Yeah.
So to liken Edward IV,
Edward.
they're not actually saying you're going to be deposed, but they're saying you're just like those three kings who incidentally were all deposed.
Yes.
I think maybe it's a way of getting round to actually being treasonous while being as near as damn it.
Yeah.
Warwick and Clarence accused Edward of being controlled by, quote, the covetous rule and guiding of certain seditious persons, unquote. And this included, amongst the inevitable coterie of Woodvilles, Sir Humphrey Stafford, also a newly ennobled upstart, and this might explain why he was so rabidly pro-Yorkist even once Henry VII had taken over the throne. Yeah. Even though, as we heard, the Stafford Rebellion wasn't that great.
No.
Another one was John Touchet, Lord Audley, which might at last explain why he sided with the Cornishmen against Henry VII.
Oh.
Because that has been a mystery for quite some time.
Yes.
Well, to us.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Somebody out there actually knows. It's not us.
We all know that. Didn't you know? When Warwick and Clarence arrived back in England, they started getting some people on their blacklist. Not Stafford or Touchet. They luckily stayed alive to become thorns in Henry VII's side.
Yes.
But got some others on their list. And then George Neville, Warwick's brother, and the Archbishop of York captured the king. The Archbishop of York captured the king. Sometimes you have to say things twice just to sort of let them sink in.
The warrior archbishop.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, those should not go together. Archbishop,
well, we had a warrior pope.
should not be going to war or capturing anybody.
No, well, particularly not the king.
Yeah.
When Edward had heard that the capture was imminent, he sent his Woodville relatives away, presumably for their own safety. Earl Rivers and his son John went to Wales, so they should be safe there, and Anthony went to Norfolk. Unfortunately, this proved to be a mistake, since Earl Rivers and John were caught at Chepstow on the English-Welsh border, and both were executed. And that explains why the 25-year-old John was outlived by his 60-something-year-old wife.
I assumed it was going to be venereal disease, to be honest. With the way this podcast goes.
I don't think John was like that, from what I've got, the very little information I've come across on him. Oh, the poor man was executed.
That was option number 2.
Yeah. There are only ever 2, aren't there? Jacquetta brought an action to the King's Bench against those she held responsible, including Warwick. But by that time, Warwick had fled back to France. And it seems that Anthony had his brother John buried at Eton College because of his love of learning. There, you're sorry you maligned him now, aren't you?
Sorry. No.
Anthony had been captured and taken to Norwich, but no one knows why he lived to tell the tale. Why wasn't he bumped off as well? Don't know. So, poor Elizabeth Woodville, her father and brother are dead, and her husband is in captivity. At this time, she must have assumed either that Henry VI would make a reappearance or that George, Duke of Clarence, would take the throne. George certainly thought that was the plan.
Oh, yes. I wonder what it would have been like if he had managed to become king. He was duplicitous. He seemed to be... Well, I guess just because he does get himself executed in a casket or a barrel of wine, we seem to think he's dumb. But I don't know if he actually is.
I suspect so. Yeah, we envisaged him wearing dungarees with one of the straps undone.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't think we need to think that hard about what it would have been like under George, Duke of Clarence. I think some of our listeners might be living under those circumstances. At the same time as all this is going on, just to put it into context, over in East Anglia, the Pastons were trying to fight off the Duke of Norfolk as he tried to take Caister Castle. So there we are.
It's funny, I'm fond of the Pastons, but they weren't all nice people. I'm just fond of them because they gave us so much information.
And we know them.
Yes, we do.
Well, I mean, once you get to know somebody, even if you know awful things about them, they become people.
Yes. Yeah.
They're not historical characters.
Yeah.
Why is everyone called John? Why call 2 of your sons John?
That was quite common. If it was a family name, they'd name more than one child that and then call them by sort of a nickname just to make sure the name carried on. I mean, how many Henrys did Henry VIII have?
True. Yeah, but one was dead before the next Henry came along.
True, but wouldn't you, not want to reuse the name in honor of your first Henry? I don't know. Nowadays, if I had a child that died, I wouldn't be naming the next child after them. No.
No, because you'd think you'd sort of stolen the soul from the first one, really, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Anyway, what led to Edward's release was Warwick's inability to put down revolts, of which there were suddenly quite a few. He needed royal authority to do so, and he obviously thought, damn it, I actually need this king now.
Oh,
going wrong. By 1469, Edward was back at court, as was Warwick, as was Clarence, as was Anthony Woodville.
Awkward.
Who was now Earl Rivers, what with Warwick having killed the last one. And to cap it all, while Edward had been in captivity, Jacquetta, his mother-in-law, had been accused of witchcraft.
Mm-hmm. Who was saved? Well, it's hard to say if she was saved by Margaret or not. Because she stood up for Margaret on several occasions. I don't know. They were friends.
They were, yeah. Well, we'll look at that in another episode when we find out how... Sometimes it's expedient to accuse high-ranking ladies of being witches.
Yes.
As might be expected, and one of the many John Pastons said, I think it's the younger of Margaret's sons, he commented, quote, "The king himself has good language of the lords of Clarence and of Warwick and of my lords York and of Oxford, saying that they be his best friends. But his household men have other language. So what shall hastily fall, I cannot see," unquote.
Other language.
Yes. They hate each other.
Yeah. Diplomatically put. Well done.
Warwick went to France with Clarence and then sent a servant to get his ship, the Trinity, from Southampton, because he wanted to indulge in a little light piracy, and he hadn't got a suitable vessel to do it in. King Edward had arranged for Anthony Woodville, he's now Earl Rivers, but I'll carry on calling him Anthony Woodville for clarity, to protect Southampton. And he captured several enemy ships. Several of the crew were hanged, drawn and quartered by none other than Mr. Tiptoft. And this is where he disgraced himself by impaling the bodies. And even at the time, during his episode, we wondered how you impale the bodies of people who are hanged, drawn and quartered.
Yes.
But,
pieces?
I don't know. Like a kebab, I suppose.
Oh, gosh, Lucy.
Sorry.
I should not laugh, but that was dark.
Sorry. Louis XI brought together the unlikely pairing of Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, as we've heard, and Edward, Margaret of Anjou's son, was married to Anne, Warwick's younger daughter. Oh. Warwick sailed over to the West Country, and Edward was so freaked out by this that he and Anthony Woodville, amongst others, including William Lord Hastings, fled for Burgundy. I didn't quite understand that. He just sort of landed and Edward thought, oh my God, and ran off. And it's quite likely Edward Woodville went too. As we'll see in his episode, where Anthony was, Edward often was too, even if he wasn't mentioned. Elizabeth and her daughters went into sanctuary. In March 1471, Edward IV returned, and bizarrely reconciled with his brother Clarence.
No idea why.
No. He rode into London without much difficulty and was reunited with his wife and children.
Who had spent the entire time in Westminster Abbey.
Then on to the Battle of Barnet, where Warwick was killed. Then at Tewkesbury, Margaret of Anjou's son Edward was killed. Anthony wasn't at Tewkesbury. He was back in London, and he was protecting it from the bastard of Fauconberg. We're sort of riddled with bastards today. Who attacked it, trying to release Henry VI. And Anthony, apparently, burst out of the Tower of London unexpectedly and laid into the enemy troops. So he was quite a fighter. King Edward rode into London with Margaret of Anjou in tow, and he obviously decided it wasn't safe having Henry VI living in the Tower, since he was a beacon to Lancastrians. But fortunately, and entirely coincidentally...
he died of a broken heart.
Pure displeasure and melancholy, yes.
Yeah, loss of his son.
Anthony Woodville. So we'll stay following Anthony for the time being. Fighting in England wasn't enough for him, so he asked permission from Edward IV to join the Portuguese and fight the Turks. Edward IV was a bit annoyed. Well, there was a lot going on in England at that time. Why do you pick now to go and fight the Turks? And in fact, he refused to let him go. And according to the younger of the two John Pastons, the king put it down to cowardice, which shows how awful it must have been in England if going to fight the Turks was thought to be the easy option.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, go there, you wimp, just going off to fight Turks. And in a fit of pique, Edward IV made Lord Hastings governor of Calais rather than Anthony. But in January 1472, Anthony was off anyway. Unfortunately, by the time he got there, it was all over. The Portuguese, having taken Tangiers, had gone home. So Anthony had lost the governorship of Calais for nothing.
For nothing.
But By April, he was helping out Francis, Duke of Brittany, and Francis had asked for 6,000 archers. Anthony brought 30, which must have been a disappointment, I think.
Wait, he just brought 30, not 30,000.
Just 30. But by the summer, Edward IV had given him permission to muster 1,000 archers, if he paid for it himself.
I was waiting.
It's great being king, isn't it?
It is. Of course
you can.
I'm so magnanimous.
Some saw this as a fine for him going off to fight the infidel without permission. And this is the first mention we get of Edward Woodville joining his brother. Before, it's just an assumption. If Anthony's there, faithful Edward was trotting along too, but he's actually there, we know. And the French troops retreated from Brittany, and there was talk of an Anglo-Breton invasion of France. But unfortunately, by this time, many of Anthony's men had died of flux, or dysentery. So it was not to be. Not a nice way to go.
No.
Anthony was given another instruction while he was in Brittany. Try and get your hands on that Jasper Tudor and his nephew and bring them back to England.
Mwahaha.
But fortunately for our podcast, Duke Francis wouldn't hand them over. No sooner had he got home from Brittany than Anthony was off again on pilgrimage to St. James of Compostela.
So he really doesn't like a home life, essentially.
It's been thought that maybe he made some vow. If I get through this certain battle, I'll go and fight the infidel. And because he hadn't managed to fight the infidel...
Now he's got to do penance.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
It must have been quite an exciting trip, since amongst other things, they saw the sickle with which St. James had been beheaded, and it's apparently still red.
Wow.
Yeah. Although it's said that everything was in a state of decay, so maybe not blood, perhaps rust. I think.
Rust.
So they saw a rusty sickle is basically what they did, what they saw. Went all the way to Spain to see a rusty sickle. But when they got back, Edward IV heaped rewards and positions on Anthony, so all forgiven. But I was thinking, actually, all this thing about Edward forgiving everybody, he was drunk quite a lot of the time, wasn't he?
He was a happy drunk.
Yes,
not
was
an
it?
Angry
You're
drunk.
my best friend. You're my best friend. Here, have a dukedom.
Oh.
Waking up in the morning thinking, what did I? Oh God, did I?
Gosh.
Oh well, it's too late now. I can't take it back. While Anthony was on pilgrimage, his wife Elizabeth, née Bourchier, died. So perhaps he came home to make the necessary arrangements. They didn't have any children.
Oh, he was never home.
No. He did have an illegitimate daughter, inevitably called Margaret. She wasn't provided for in his will, which has led some to speculate that he had no fatherly feelings for her.
What a jerk.
He had already settled land on her and arranged a good marriage, so I don't think we should necessarily jump to conclusions about it. He probably thought, oh, I've done the necessary.
Yeah, bare minimum.
If he wasn't a very hands-on father, which we don't know, he was a very attentive uncle. And he was one of the council commissioned to mentor young Edward, later to be Edward V, later to be one of the princes in the Tower, later to be murdered, probably.
Don't start that again.
No. He moved down to Ludlow to be with the boy, and Edward IV sent Anthony a list of do's and don'ts for bringing up the young prince. From what time he should get up in the morning, to who was allowed to sit at his table at mealtime. So Richard III wasn't the only micromanager. Anthony was designated governor and ruler of young Edward, which shows that the king must have had complete trust in him.
Yes.
Edward must have been his most special possession. So, yeah, Anthony was described by Mancini, who seemed to be sort of travelling about the place at this time, quote, always considered a kind, serious and just man, and one tested in every vicissitude of life, unquote.
I don't know what that means.
Well, I suppose he's lost family members, he's had to fight.
Oh, see, and I was thinking tested for sin, and I'm like, well, he did have illegitimate children, so he failed there. He's a violent man. Failure.
Well, he wasn't always kind. If he had a property he was interested in, he wasn't above rummaging through legal documents to try and prove that you have no right to that property.
But neither was anybody else.
Compared to what we heard in the Paston episodes, he sounds relatively benign.
Yes, relatively.
Anthony didn't spend all his time babysitting the Prince of Wales. He was with Edward IV when he set off to invade France and came back with a pension. Although we don't hear of Anthony being part of this pension. You wonder what the people who came back with nothing thought.
I don't know. Like, I did work.
Yeah. Why didn't you put my name down on the list?
Yeah.
Edward had been badly let down by both Charles the Bold of Burgundy and Jacquetta's brother, the Count of St. Pol, who has been supposed to help him fight the French. And this might have repercussions for Charles the Bold later. Still keen on giving his soul a good scrubbing, Anthony set off to Rome this time, where he had all his belongings nicked, and his sister, the Queen, had to bail him out. It's a proper gap year holiday, isn't
yes.
it? It's like the panicky phone calls I get from my son saying, I've lost my card, can you send me some money? Where are you?
Help,
Vietnam. Think, oh, God.
Oh, God.
Anyway, the Roman authorities found the culprits. At least they found some Germans who confessed to the crime. But they would, since they were put to the rack.
Oh.
Yeah. On his way home, Anthony met up with Charles the Bold. And when he heard that Charles was preparing to fight the Swiss, he asked if he could join in. But then he heard that the battle was imminent and suddenly remembered a prior engagement.
Oh.
And again, it's the Milanese ambassador, quote, Monsieur de Scales, brother of the Queen of England, has been to see the Duke and offered to take his line in battle. But hearing the day before yesterday that the enemy was near at hand, he asked leave to depart, saying he was sorry he could not stay, and so he took leave and went. This is esteemed great cowardice in him and lack of spirit and honour. The Duke laughed about it to me, saying, he is gone because he is afraid, unquote.
Famous last words.
Well, Anthony's been in battles before.
Yeah.
He's not a coward.
No, but maybe he reckons, okay, Charles doesn't know what he's doing and the Swiss are really good.
Well, that's what I wondered, whether he heard things about the Swiss and thought... And also, he might have also thought, what am I doing? I don't owe Charles anything. He let Edward IV down.
Yeah.
While Anthony was away, his mother Jacquetta died.
Aww. I don't know why I like her. I don't have an answer for that. I just really like Jacquetta.
Well, she seems to be no trouble, does she?
No.
Yeah.
She actually married for love.
Yeah.
Supported her children.
Yeah. Printing. In early 1476, William Caxton set up his shop under the Red Pale in Westminster. One of his main sponsors was Anthony Woodville. Anthony translated the Dicts and Sayings of the Philosophers, which was printed by Caxton. And he picked up this book when he was on pilgrimage to Compostela, but hadn't found the time to do it justice. And it was only when he became the governor of little Prince Edward that he had time on his hands. As we've come to expect, in the preface, he apologised for any faults and mistakes. Don't bother to read it, it's not worth it. Don't know why I did it, frankly. We saw in his episode that Caxton wrote an epilogue to the book saying that he'd noticed that Anthony had left out some rather misogynistic comments of Socrates, which he teased maybe some lady Anthony was fond of had told him to leave out. Which is a bit risque given how much further up the social scale Anthony was to Caxton. So
yeah,
it implies they were friends and that Anthony didn't necessarily take himself too seriously.
Yeah, which says well for him, speaks well for him.
Yeah, I don't think you'd say that to the Earl of Warwick, would you?
No.
At this time, Anthony was the only nobleman who patronised Caxton. Later, John de Vere and William Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, asked him to translate and print works. But as far as I know, Anthony was the only noble to do the translating himself for Caxton. And there's a woodcut of the Dicts of the Philosophers that's very similar to the one in Henry VII's astrology book, showing Anthony handing the copy to the king.
Mm.
I think there's a sort of template for that picture.
Probably. This is not a likeness.
No. George, Duke of Clarence. Ugh. Over in Burgundy, Charles the Bold had been killed at the Battle of Nancy and had his head eaten off by wolves. And this meant that Mary of Burgundy was now in charge, and so obviously the little lady would need a man to show her how to do it.
Of course she would.
Margaret of Burgundy's preference was for her newly widowed brother, George. Mary herself...
No, it wasn't.
Margaret's was.
Margaret of Burgundy.
Yeah.
No.
What was hers then?
Maximilian.
I thought she went to Maximilian once it became...
Nope.
After George had said he wouldn't do it.
Nope.
Oh.
She never wanted George. She always supported Maximilian.
Mm. Well, Mary herself favoured Maximilian, but Edward IV didn't think much of that idea and favoured Anthony Woodville. He even offered Mary military support if she married Anthony.
Really?
Yes. Philip de Comines said that Mary was hardly likely to go for that idea, given that he was, quote, only an earl, unquote.
True. And recent, too.
Yeah, I don't think Philip de Comines was putting down Anthony. I think he was just stating a fact.
Yes.
Don't waste your time. By June 1477, George was in the Tower anyway, and the following February he was executed. Before his execution, George handed over lands to Anthony Woodville, quote, in consideration of injuries perpetrated on him and his parents, unquote. So what specifically was George getting at?
I don't know.
George's fate was another of those occasions passed down to us when the Woodvilles were seen to be high-handed and vengeful. Because we heard in Lambert Simnel's episode that Robert Stillington, that gossipy bishop of Bath and Wells, told George that his brother King Edward was illegitimate. And we're told that the Woodvilles were afraid that George would cause trouble and Elizabeth's children would lose their right to the throne.
Right.
Therefore, it was necessary to get rid of George.
Oh, because George would have been legitimate.
George would have been legitimate, and he was about to put out the idea that Edward wasn't,
right,
and therefore Edward's children weren't. So let's get George dunked into that vat of Malmsey as quickly as we possibly can. This story was to have a knock-on effect in that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, vowed to avenge his brother's execution. It might also have been that the Woodvilles wanted George out of the way, not just because he might hold information which could be a threat to the succession, but also he had been responsible with the Earl of Warwick for the execution of their father and brother John. They might all be living in the same place and pretending to be friends, but you don't forget that sort of thing.
Nope.
I think once they saw an opportunity, they probably might as well have taken it. So did George give Anthony that land in an I'm sorry I killed your dad and brother idea? But if that was the case, ultimately, it didn't do him any good.
No.
Back to Anthony. Meanwhile, since he missed out on Mary of Burgundy, Anthony was still an eligible widower, and James III of Scotland offered him his sister Margaret. The Bishop of Rochester and Edward Woodville went north to start negotiations. By March 1479, it was all sorted. The marriage was delayed by the machinations of James's brother, the Duke of Albany, which we heard about in Cecily of York episode, when her marriage prospects sort of flip-flopped between the two sides of the family. And just as Cecily's marriages were on and off, Anthony's marriage plans were soon abandoned. And instead he married Mary Fitzlewis. She was the granddaughter of Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who had screwed up so badly in France.
Mm.
And she was the cousin to Sir Henry Stafford, who had married Margaret Beaufort. Anthony was about 40 at this time. This is 1480. Mary was 13.
Yeah.
Not nice.
Nope.
This is the time that Margaret of Burgundy did her little jaunt back to England, and Edward Woodville was sent to Calais to meet her. On her way back 3 months later, she stayed on Anthony's estate, and they must have had a lot to talk about since they were both patrons of William Caxton. So they could talk books and that.
They actually had something in common.
Yeah. Soon after, Edward IV heard rumours that the Calais garrison were a bit iffy in their loyalty, and that included the Marquis of Dorset and Anthony Woodville. And that was odd, because there'd never been any impugning of the loyalty before.
Yeah.
This was later seen to be a put-up job headed by Lord Hastings, who was captain of Calais, and who had a particular aversion to Anthony, to the extent of trying to get him executed for treason.
That's definitely an aversion.
That's
extreme.
Yeah, I don't much like him. He needs to die.
Yeah.
Lionel. Meanwhile, what of the other Woodvilles, namely Lionel? He had been earmarked for the church. He was at Oxford with Walter Paston, Margaret Paston's favourite son, because he didn't let her down or show her up or give her any trouble. But then he sadly picked up the plague and died. Walter, I mean, not Lionel. No sooner had Lionel graduated than he was made Dean of Exeter, Archdeacon of Surrey, and Chancellor of Oxford University.
Wow.
When the position became vacant, Lionel became Bishop of Salisbury too. What it is to be related to the king.
Yeah. Handy.
Yeah. There's an interesting bit of gossip concerning Lionel Woodville. Did he father a son?
Okay.
And was that son Stephen Gardiner?
Oh.
Yeah, the future Bishop of Winchester, and played in Wolf Hall, first by Mark Gatiss and then by Alex Jennings.
Yeah.
Not sure why Mark Gatiss didn't come back to do the second series, but he didn't. Well, no, almost certainly not.
Oh. No.
For the simple reason that Gardiner was born in the 1490s and Lionel died in 1484.
Why did we bring this up? Do people think it happened?
Yes, it wasn't until 1926 that with a simple bit of maths, that rumour was finally put to bed.
Wow.
Yes, it was thought, Stephen Gardiner, his dad was from Lionel Woodville, you know.
Really?
Until 1926.
Wow.
And it's not as if you discovered new documents or anything, so obviously someone thought, hang on, 2940. No, it can't be done.
There's no such thing as in vitro freezing.
No.
That doesn't come about for another several hundred years.
Yes, it wasn't even around in 1926.
No.
The death of King Edward. Anthony was now joined by his nephew Richard Grey in looking after the now 12-year-old prince. King Edward sent them another set of instructions about how to look after the boy, and his bedtime was moved from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock, now that he was 12. Yeah, staying up late. It has been suggested that the Woodvilles kept the news of Edward IV's death from Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and he only learnt about it when William Lord Hastings told him. And that was a pretty weighted statement. Yes, he did learn it from Hastings, but in a perfectly normal way. In fact, Gloucester learnt about Edward's death before Prince Edward did. So it was common knowledge as far as Calais before either of them knew. So it wasn't that the news was especially being kept away from Gloucester. Gloucester was up in the north. It takes a long time for information to get up there.
Yes, it does.
Hastings despised the Woodvilles and may have put into Richard's head the idea that they planned to take over. And it was Hastings who insisted that the entourage accompanying the new king to London should be small, quote, a sober company, unquote. Too small to be a pro-Woodville army. I wondered if he was still annoyed about the collapse of that scheme whereby Elizabeth Woodville's sons would marry his imaginary daughter. I don't know whether he actually had a daughter in the end, but
Probably not.
But by the sound of it, she sort of dropped him. You know, I don't need that anymore. I married the king.
Yeah.
So he might have been niggling about in his brain.
Here's your money.
But when Edward V and his uncle Anthony Woodville were at Ludlow Castle, the young king gave Anthony power to raise troops in the Welsh marches, quote, if need be, unquote. And this could be seen in two ways. I mean, everything that involves the Woodvilles and Rich III could be seen very much in two ways. Did the king trust Anthony so much that he used him for his protection? Or did Anthony persuade the 12-year-old boy to let him raise troops to ensure his own political standing?
Oh, and it could be either.
It could be either. That's what makes this whole story run and run, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you can just pick your side. There has been some doubt as to whether the Woodvilles intended to include Richard in their plans. They were criticised for holding a council meeting before Richard was able to join them. And according to Mancini, Thomas, Marquess of Dorset, said, quote, we are so important that even without the king's uncle we can make and enforce these decisions, unquote. So, yeah, we're bigger than Jesus, he's effectively saying. And that wasn't going to endear them to people.
No, it will not, especially when they already kind of see you as an upstart family.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose maybe some people of the sort of lower gentry nobility might have looked to the Woodvilles and thought,
I could do it
anyone
too.
can do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought, great. It's great that we've got one of us.
Yeah.
Richard had been made protector, but that would only last until young Edward was crowned. After that, the council would govern until he reached majority. And the council had already convened before Richard got there. So was it the Woodvilles' intention to shut Richard out after the coronation? Or at least, was that what he was worried about? Which pretty much amounts to the same thing as far as later events were concerned. Doesn't really matter if it's true, it just matters if that's what Richard thought.
Right.
And this might explain why the council elected to have the coronation on May the 4th. It wasn't that it's Star Wars Day. It was possibly that they were making Richard's protectorate as short as possible.
I would have as well.
Yeah, making sure he didn't get too comfy in that role. It was Hastings who was writing to Richard telling him to get to London with a full force and, quote, avenge the insult done to him by his enemies, unquote. And Gloucester wrote to Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, quote, complaining to the latter of the insult done to him by the ignoble family of the Queen, unquote.
Yeah, it's a little hard to keep people sorted when they all have the same name.
It really is. And he could expect sympathetic hearing from Stafford, since he had been forced to marry Catherine Woodville when he was too young to refuse.
Catherine, that's her name, Catherine.
Catherine. Edward V, with Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey, amongst others, set off for London. By the 29th of April, they reached Stony Stratford. Anthony and Richard Grey then split off from the group and went to Northampton to reach Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard of Gloucester was really pleased to see them and greeted them, quote, with a particularly cheerful and merry face, unquote. And I'm sure Richard was pleased to see them in a sort of come into my parlour type of way. Anthony and Richard went to the pub together and had a few drinks. They were just starting dinner when who should come in but the Duke of Buckingham. And that's Anthony's brother-in-law, so, nothing to worry about there.
But it's a brother-in-law who hates him.
He had 300 men with him, and he joined them for dinner, and a merry time was had by all. Anthony was late to bed, which was unfortunate given how early he was woken the next day. The inn was surrounded by Richard's people, and Anthony went to Richard and Buckingham to ask what was going on. They accused him of intending, as Thomas More later said, quote, to set distance between the king and them, unquote. And Anthony was promptly arrested. And so was Richard Grey. They were first imprisoned in Northampton. Richard and Buckingham were having a celebratory dinner at the inn, and they sent a dish of food from their table to Anthony in his prison. And he sent his thanks, but said that the food should go to Richard Grey, quote, who, unused to adversity, needed comfort the more. He himself was well acquainted with the fickleness of fortune, unquote. Gloucester then told the young king he'd had to arrest them because they had led his father into debauchery. Which seems an odd thing to say to the man's son, I think.
Yeah.
Richard was surprised that his nephew didn't instantly believe him. Young Edward V said he'd seen nothing evil in the men, quote, and wished to keep them unless otherwise proved to be evil, unquote. But Anthony was sent to Sheriff Hutton and Richard Grey to Middleham. Elizabeth Woodville and her children, accompanied by Lionel Woodville, fled to sanctuary. And this is one of those events, another of those events, which is so easy to see the way you want it to be. If you're a Ricardian, you might think that the Woodvilles had it coming. They'd tried to oust the man who'd been chosen by Edward IV to look after his son. Mm-hmm. And they were obviously planning a coup to take over the country with young Edward as their puppet. He
really is a puppy.
If you dislike Richard, Duke of Gloucester, you'll see the Woodvilles as innocent victims of Richard's machinations. Mm-hmm. They were trying to protect the young king from someone they saw as dangerous. So really, you just take your pick, depending on which version you feel comfortable with.
Well, it's also the fact that the boys disappear gives Richard the more sinister look.
Yes, and if he's not guilty of it, it's unfortunate for him that he is seen to be such a pantomime villain, really. So were Anthony and Richard Grey guilty of waging a coup d'etat? The only source we have stating that they were was Gloucester himself. Other sources, although they may not know for certain, were sceptical.
Okay.
Would Anthony and Richard Grey have gone off to spend the evening with Gloucester if they felt that they'd given themselves a reason to fear Gloucester?
No.
By rising up against him. Surely they'd have stayed with Edward V's entourage and just kept going to London as quickly as they could. Was it a complete bolt from the blue?
Yeah.
Did Elizabeth Woodville's flight into sanctuary imply guilt? Well, maybe, but not necessarily. She'd fled to sanctuary when her husband had been taken prisoner. Perhaps it was her first thought. When things go bad.
Run. Yeah.
Get your children to somewhere safe.
Well, she'd already done it once, so it's something she knows is an option.
Yeah. Might be her natural first thought. She must have realised they could all be in the firing line.
Yeah.
Anthony was stripped of his position as chief butler, and the post was given to Francis Lovell.
Ooh.
Gloucester moves in. So that sounded sinister, didn't it?
Yes.
I'm trying to go straight down the middle between the various arguments. Why did Gloucester act as he did? And I'm calling him Gloucester because there are so many Richards. It just gets confusing. Mm-hmm. In many ways, it's a mystery. He hadn't seemed to feel a great enmity against the Woodvilles in the past. Mancini said he blamed them for the death of his brother George, but he wasn't particularly close to his brother George, was he?
No.
They'd been bickering over an inheritance, which had got pretty acrimonious.
Yes.
But he was still his brother, and blood's thicker than water.
Sometimes.
Yeah. And Gloucester and Clarence might have bonded over making their poor mother-in-law one of the undead. They might have... They got together. They have one thing in common, the fact that they want the money out of their mother-in-law.
Yep.
Would Gloucester have seen the Woodvilles as a threat to his northern territories? It's unlikely, because we saw in Percy's episode just how incredibly powerful he was up there.
Yeah.
And when he went to Scotland and wandered into Edinburgh unhindered that time, Edward Woodville and Thomas Marquis and Dorset were there too. They were all on the same side.
Yeah.
Was Gloucester afraid the Woodvilles would have him bumped off if they got power? Many think so.
So that would be fear-based, fear-motivated then.
Yeah. And again, it's not so much would they have done it, but did he think they would have done it? Mm-hmm. Which is the same thing, effectively. Also, he might have decided he was already having the throne. Gossipy Robert Stillington had been putting around rumours not only that Edward IV had been contracted to Eleanor Butler, but that he, Stillington, had actually married them. And this was either very useful propaganda for Gloucester, or he believed it and generally felt that that precluded Edward V from the throne.
Yes, but he also started by saying that Edward was illegitimate and his mother slashed him down.
Probably literally.
Yes. Whack.
And we still don't know if Stillington was telling the truth or not.
Yeah.
None of us are in a position to say one thing or the other.
No.
Although, obviously, plenty of us do. Personally, I think Hastings has a lot to answer for here. He was writing to Gloucester telling him he should rise up against the Woodvilles. Get them before they get you.
Which isn't bad advice if that is a possibility.
Yeah. And we don't know whether Hastings was just putting unpleasant ideas into Richard's head or whether he really believed it. Mm-hmm. But the fact that he tried to get Anthony convicted of treason for which there was no proof whatsoever when they're in Calais implies that he would pretty much do anything.
Yeah.
Gloucester was in the north. He was in no position to know for certain what was going on or what their intentions were. He only had it filtered through Hastings, as far as I know. But the council that heard the trial of Anthony and Richard Grey refused to convict them. As we heard in Percy's episode, they said, quote, "There appeared no certain case," unquote. And Henry Percy and Richard Ratcliffe knew what was required of them, and they convicted the two men. Without any real trial. Anyway, 2 down, but so many more to go. If only Chiquetta hadn't been so damn fertile. Gloucester set about stripping the Woodvilles of their possessions, some of which went to Francis Lovell. And now, the legality of this is highly suspect, unless the rumours that the Woodvilles had pocketed the royal treasury was true. Then Gloucester was just getting back what he would consider rightfully the property of the king. And he had the king. He was the king's protector. As far as we can tell, this rumour comes solely from Mancini, who said that Edward Woodville headed off to sea with 1/3 of the treasury, Elizabeth Woodville had 1/3, and Thomas Marquis of Dorset had 1/3. But even Mancini didn't say he knew this for a fact, merely that it was what was commonly believed. And it may have been believed because that was the official publicised story. But this was surely something that it would be possible to find out, that we have accounts. And Rosemary Horrocks has done just that, and concluded that Edward IV hadn't got much to leave anyway. When we remember how he defaulted payment to the Medici Bank, he was probably living largely in debt, so there was no treasury to run off with. And he had been at war with Scotland. That's expensive.
Very.
And if the story were true, then when Gloucester became Richard III, he'd have made damn sure he got the money back, and he didn't. So it implies that that story was just put about, probably by Hastings, because he seems to put most of them about. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Bourchier, was sent by Gloucester to get Edward IV's gold, jewels and seals from Elizabeth. And as far as I know, she did give them up. But presumably she thought the goods and jewels would be hers if they had been her husband's. The seals are a bit of a different matter, but she would probably be keeping them for her son. So it's not necessarily that she's run off with the treasury, it's just she'd probably thought, well, I've got my own stuff which I need to have with me to pay for our sanctuary and look after my children. While all this was going on, Anthony and Richard Grey were imprisoned in the north. Elizabeth Woodville had refused to come out of sanctuary, and it's probable she was waiting to see what would become of her brother and son.
God, I can't imagine how that would feel.
No. Well, she was right to be worried. Gloucester was writing to the city of York, telling them, quote, "to aid and assist us against the Queen, her blood adherents and affinity, which have intended and daily doth intend to murder and utterly destroy us and our cousin the Duke of Buckingham, and the old royal blood of this realm, and it is now openly known, by their subtle and damnable ways, forecasted the same, and also the final destruction and disinheritance of you and all the other inheritors and men of honour, as well as the northern parts of other counties, that being unto us," unquote. And this may be true, but I wondered how they were in any position to do this, the thing he was accusing them of. Elizabeth, her children and Lionel were in sanctuary, Edward was on the high seas, Anthony and Richard Grey were in prison, Thomas Marquis and Dorset was still out and about. We might find out what he was up to in his own episode. I think he was probably in Brittany by this point. Maybe there were Woodville adherents bent on Gloucester's destruction. But we also know that he accused Elizabeth of wanting to bring him down by witchcraft.
That always makes me so mad. When all else fails, blame the woman of witchcraft.
Well, it's an easy way of getting at the woman, isn't it?
Yeah.
The part of Gloucester's letter that read, quote, by their subtle damnable ways forecasted the same, unquote, is a reference to astrology. And 3 astrological men were named as possible culprits, and we know them all. John Argentine was Edward IV's doctor. Louis Caerleon was the doctor who took messages between Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort. And Thomas Landyke, we did an episode on. He was the Duke of Buckingham's necromancer.
Yeah.
So he was hardly likely to go against Gloucester. And indeed, Gloucester didn't go against any of them. He didn't chase any of it up. So did he really believe they were using astrology against him?
No.
No. Hastings was a very happy man. He was said to be, quote, asserting that nothing had so far been done except to transfer the government of the kingdom from 2 blood relatives of the Queen to 2 nobles of royal blood. With only so much bloodshed in the affair as you might get from a cut finger, unquote.
Oh my goodness.
And history is very cringy when people make comments like that.
I'm cringy.
You think, I know what happens. Yes, you'll be wishing you'd had a cut finger by the end of this. On Friday the 13th of June, 1483, Gloucester called a council meeting in the Tower of London. And we've looked at this meeting before. There was a lot of talk about strawberries, and then Gloucester had Hastings taken out and beheaded.
It's just so...
That was basically the agenda, wasn't it?
Weird, yes.
1 strawberries, 2 behead Hastings. Why? Now, Hastings was the one who'd been writing to Gloucester, telling him to get down here quick and take the Woodvilles down. Well, there are 2 possible reasons. One was that Gloucester knew that Hastings wouldn't approve of him pushing Edward V aside and taking the throne himself, because it's one thing getting rid of the Woodvilles, but a different thing undermining what Hastings might have seen as the rightful succession. Or was Hastings plotting against Gloucester?
Well, that's kind of what he claimed.
Yeah, well, Thomas More tells us that Gloucester revealed his withered arm and accused Elizabeth and Hastings' mistress, known rather dismissively as Shaw's wife, of using witchcraft on him.
He'd always had a withered arm.
Yes. I don't know why this was never mentioned. Whether anybody said, yeah, we've seen that before.
Yeah, you were born with it.
Yeah.
And the mistress wasn't born yet.
But Hastings hated the Woodvilles. Why would he now be conniving with Elizabeth against Gloucester?
Gosh.
Unless maybe Elizabeth had come to him, well, not come to him because she's in sanctuary, had sent a message and told him that she'd heard Gloucester intended to take the throne. Well, who knows? But I'm sure we'll come across Shaw's wife again when we do Thomas Marquis of Dorset, since apparently she was a very friendly lady.
Ah, okay.
After Hastings' murder, or execution, there was no one to stop Gloucester and Buckingham. According to Crowland's Chronicle, they took, quote, a great crowd with swords and clubs, unquote, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Bourchier, and forced him to tell Elizabeth to hand the Duke of York over, the little boy. And that explains a lot. We weren't sure why he would have done it, since he was a friend of the family.
Yeah.
But evidently he was threatened with violence.
And that, at that time, that's not a threat you can ignore.
No.
No. You're going to be lucky if they don't continue with the violence even after you do what they tell you to.
Especially from people as powerful as Richard and the Duke of Buckingham. People
who have killed people before.
Yes, and it's probably no point saying, but I'm the Archbishop of Canterbury. No. Elizabeth must have felt she'd made a big mistake when she finally heard that Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey, her brother and son, had been executed.
So she heard this after she gave up her son?
Yeah.
Oh.
And it was discovered that Anthony had been in the habit of wearing a hair shirt. Just before his execution, he consoled himself writing poetry. Quote, my life was lent, me to one intent, it is nigh spent, welcome fortune. But I never went, thus to be shent, I don't know what shent means, but so it meant, such is her wont, unquote.
It sounds more like a limerick.
It does. It's as your last word. I probably didn't read it with enough feeling. Maybe that was it.
Just add a tune to it. You're good to go.
Some 20 years later, Elizabeth of York remembered her uncle Anthony, and she gave money to, quote, a man from Pointrait, unquote, probably Pontefract, because Anthony had lodged at his house at the time of his death, which makes him his jailer, really.
Yeah.
But maybe news got back that the man had treated him with compassion. If they all thought he was innocent up there, why not? Richard III. Richard called the Woodvilles, quote, insolent, vicious, and of inordinate avarice, unquote, says the man who made his mother-in-law legally dead to get his hands on her money.
Yeah. So
When Richard went on progress, one of his first stops was Oxford, and he was greeted by William Harford, Chancellor in the Commission of Peace for Oxford. I don't know why you need peace in Oxford particularly, but that was his job. It would have been normal for Richard to be met by the Chancellor of the University, but that was Lionel Woodville, the uncle and brother of the men Richard had just executed, seemingly without trial, and somebody who was in sanctuary because he was afraid of Richard.
This is so tangled.
By October, Richard had sent out a proclamation for whoever caught Thomas, Marquess of Dorset, the Bishop of Exeter, John Morton, and Lionel Woodville. Dorset escaped to Brittany, and Lionel, and probably Richard, who's the shadowy Woodville, sought sanctuary in Beaulieu Abbey, later to offer sanctuary to Perkin Warbeck. Well, they didn't offer it. I mean, he just came and took
showed
it.
up and said, sanctuary, please. All right.
By December of the following year, Lionel was dead. We don't know what he died of or where he died, but we know he did because Richard III authorised the election of his successor as Bishop of Salisbury. He'd gone over to Brittany to join his brother Edward and Henry Tudor, so he might have died there. Catherine Woodville was widowed following the rebellion and execution of the Duke of Buckingham, and she was sent either to a religious house or to an estate of one of Richard's followers. She was given an annuity of £200 a year, but we don't hear any more of her until Henry comes to the throne and she marries Jasper. In March 1485, Richard Woodville was pardoned, although there's no evidence that he had his property returned to him, so I'm not sure how he lived. We hear very little about him. Once Henry was on the throne, everything started getting better for the remaining Woodvilles, as we shall see next time when we look at the life of Edward Woodville. However, there were 5 Woodville brothers, and not one of them left a son, which might explain why they fall out of history. Everything is Woodville at this time.
Yeah, and then nothing.
And then nothing. You don't hear about the Woodvilles for the rest of the Tudors.
Wow.
And that's why they didn't have sons. And next week, we will look at Edward Woodville and see what he got up to.
Yeah.
In his very own episode.
Interesting that such an important family would die out, basically, in one generation, except for the Tudor bloodline.
Yeah, the women were still there, but obviously they weren't Woodvilles.
Yes, they get married to different people and have different last names.
Yeah, there's a Woodville strain through most of the great families of England.
Yes.
Since they married most of them.
Yes. Interesting.
It hadn't occurred to me before that they just disappear.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, we'll see you next week to talk about Edward.
Yes. Thank you for listening.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.